My name is Jessica Howell. I convene the Global Health Humanities Initiative at the Glasscock Center in my role as Associate Director there. And it's been my pleasure to work with Emily on this event today, which I've found so thought-provoking. And so this really just gives us a space and a time to start to draw together some of these threads across panels and put them in conversation. I do want to take the opportunity to thank Victoria Green officially from all of us for her wonderful wonderful work at the conference. It just has absolutely run seamlessly and has just been so impressive. So thank you, Victoria. And to the whole team, to Shannon Gonzenbach, Lee Goyko, Amanda Dudek, who's on maternity leave but worked behind the scenes on this, and also to our director, Emily Brady. So. We have one of our invited guest speakers on Zoom. Welcome back, Jamie, and the rest of those speakers who are available to stay here with us. And this is really, I think, an opportunity to have a conversation across panels and with our keynote speaker. So I really would love to hear from all of you. Often when I present at a conference, I wish that I had heard the person who goes right after me speak right before me, and I just wish that I had more time to start to have that kind of roundtable conversation. So my first invitation will be to the panelists to think across some of the key questions or issues of each other's panels and to talk to each other's panels, really. And then I'd like to open up to the attendees and invite you all to ask a question that might put the panels in conversation, or if you have any remaining burning questions that came up for you as you've been looking back over the talks of the last day and change. So that's really what I'd like to use this time for. I can kick things off by asking what I think is a cross-panel topic or question and turn it over to all of you, and then hopefully that will give you time for the panelists to start to pull together some of the threads that might connect each other's work. So one thing that came out of the last panel for me that I thought might be a useful way to get our conversation started is if you could address the role of collaboration with community in your research design and your research plan, and maybe even your research outputs, some of your publications, for example. So specifically, could you address how your training in the humanities, humanistic social sciences, and or cross-disciplinary health studies, so I want to be inclusive in everybody's training, informs how and why you use community collaboration? So that's something that I think Priya spoke to in the very final talk. And so I'd like for us to think about collaboratively, how do you use community participation in your research, and why is it important? So I think that there's some really clear ways in which talks by Nancy Tuana, Nicole Redvers, Mayari Hengistran, Rose Jolly, Michelle Meyer, Priya Dave, and Dan Mahoney have spoken to community collaboration, but if there are any of the rest of you who might want to chime in on the potential you see in your work with community collaboration, or if you want to speak to each other about your experiences in that, that would be lovely. So I think that we have the mic behind us here. Yeah, and I'll just ask for volunteers to kick us off.
Yeah, so I think what encouraged me to put that within my presentation is this year I took a class with a group of 18 physicians and medical professionals who came from all over the globe. So there were physicians from Haiti, from Malawi, from really from the global south who came to Harvard for a year of study. And I think there was a disparity between what the faculty at Harvard had published and what they had published. They were not in the literature, they hadn't published anything. And one of our professors had told them, well, you should just go out and publish. And it's really not that easy. I'm having, I think every graduate student has difficulties with that. And so I think it would be so encouraging if we could uplift individuals from lower resource countries or lower resource experiences, or individuals who don't have as much publication experience, and include them as co-authors within our work.
I don't have a clear thought at the moment, so please excuse me if I bounce around a little bit. Thinking about collaboration with community in research design and methods. For the work that I presented today, it was a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. And inherently in working and researching those organizations, you need their buy-in and trust to allow you into their processes. And so that gets a little inherently fraught sometimes, because sometimes what you're learning about them, you might want to speak to with a critical lens, and they're not ready for that critical lens, or ready to take it as a place to learn, right, about themselves. And so there's this, I don't have a good answer for it, but there's this challenge in terms of thinking about co-publishing, right, of how do you co-publish a story that is fully honest about good things and bad things when you're working with organizations that only want good things said about them, even if it's completely, if you hide the organizations and it's completely confidential. How do you have those types of discussions? And that has been my challenge in doing collaboration in terms of research with the communities that I presented on today.
Okay, well, I'm going to come at this a different kind of way and say that I've had quite fantastic experiences working with community. So I work primarily and have always worked primarily with communities that are highly stigmatized. So I started with victim survivors of state-sponsored torture in South Africa. And you would think that in the post-apartheid era that those people would be celebrated, but it so happens that bodily scarring of various kinds and emotional scarring of various kinds is still stigmatized, and I could always talk to you about that. So what does it mean to develop a relationship? So I developed a good relationship with my community, but it meant that, or the communities I was working with in South Africa, but it meant that I had to go back every year for 3 months. So I think one of the real issues with working with communities and building trust is it can't be what many people who critique the North in many kind of northern interventions in the South call seagull management, where researchers fly in, shit on the community, and leave again, okay? And that's why it's called seagull management. And so one of the things I want to say is that sometimes you have to listen to your community and not your colleagues. So, I mean, at one point in my first grant that fortunately I had signing authority on, the person who was in the grant with me didn't want to use the grant for what he called development. And we were asking about sexual assault in a community that had no clinics and where the rape crisis manual was only written in English. So I said, okay, obviously the first thing we have to do and the most obvious thing we have to do is translate it into isiZulu. And he said, no, but that's not research, right? And I'm like, oh, that's such crap. So I just signed the check. But the point is that this division between research and what a community needs when you're working with a community, whether it be like in Igloolik or South Washington or South Africa, has a whole bunch of ethics tied to it that must exceed, obviously, the determination of research within the university bounds. And the second thing I would say is when you're working on these severely stigmatized issues, you really have to be listening to people in the community from a position of a certain kind of trust and humility. So when I think of practical ways in which I've engaged the community, I was trying to get a discussion going once around points of puberty and intergenerational learning around sexuality in KwaZulu-Natal, and the best way I could do it was to tell my own story about having not been warned that I was going to get my period for various familial reasons I won't go into, and found myself bleeding at boarding school and thought I was dying, you know, and that was a great introduction, okay? That was because it wasn't me, yeah, I'm a performer, you all know that now, but it's a performance with a certain kind of vulnerability to it, that I can't even tell that story now without being slightly wobbly about it, right? And so that gave the women a way to respond. And when one of them did respond, she responded very anxiously about the fact that she was never, ever going to tell her grandchild. This was an era when all the parents were dead. Excuse me for exaggerating, but it wasn't that much of an exaggeration. And the grannies were raising the kids. This is AIDS. And so, everybody, even her own community, was stigmatizing her and saying, how can you not tell your child, your grandchild's gonna end up like Rose, kind of thing. My name in Zulu is Mbali, your grandchild's gonna end up like Mbali. So I took her out because there was something going on, and then I figured out that, long story short, very long story short, I learned that what she had associated with, if I tell my child she's gonna menstruate, my grandchild, then she will menstruate, then she's gonna be available for rape, if that makes any sense at all, okay? So what I'm saying to you is, you can't judge. You have to be with. And there's a beautiful name in isiXhosa called Lutando. It's actually a woman's name. It's often given to men, but it's really a woman's name. And it means to be with. Wait with us, is it? Wait with us. And so that's what I would say about community engagement.
I would just add that in what I do at the bedside, that is palliative care. We sit and we be with the community of the dying, and we just support them. We meet them exactly where they're at, and it doesn't matter if a family is, if that's the members of their community are denying that the dying process is taking place, or whatever there are beliefs about the sort of who is at fault or what is at fault for missing or delaying diagnosis, things like that. Sitting with the family, sitting with the community, meeting them exactly where they are, and using that as a starting point. That humility, that willingness to be vulnerable and put yourself in their position at the outset is really the only way to move forward together.
So I attend the University of Texas at Dallas, and when I started my master's there 2 years ago, I noticed that monarch way stations were put in place all over campus. I have a background in entomology, so I'm aware of what milkweed species should be used, where way stations should be placed, and I noticed that it was placed in areas with high traffic, areas that people would walk over the grass, and the wrong species of milkweed. And so, and ATEC at UTD, I was a part of the lab, social practice and community engagement. So I tabled this issue there and discussed all of these issues that came from a good place. I don't know the organization, but it was just a student-run organization, not based in like any science school. And so we were able to address this problem in the lab, and we met with the group, and we were able to talk about where they should be placed, what kind of milkweed you should use, what time of the year you should plant the milkweed. So all of this is to say that, the community at UTD was able to be formed because we were able to reach across the aisle. We were able to reject the boundary or the binary of science versus art and humanity. And not to privilege qualitative research over quantitative research.
Do either Krithka or Jamie want to address collaboration with community? Okay.
So I'd start by saying that community to me can mean many different things. There's community in the sense of vulnerable people. There's community in the sense of the elite or institutions, organizations, and then there's the non-human community. And these are three different constituencies that I encounter in the course of my research. So my original background is in social work, and I trained in social work in India in rural and urban community development. And the way our social work training happens there is that 2 days of the week you're placed in a community. My first year of training was with ragpickers in Bombay, and the second year was with a Dalit community also in a slum in Bombay. And field work was, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't continue practicing as a social worker, because what I found was that I struggled because as a social worker, you are expected to go and bring about transformation, community transformation. And over those 2 years with both sets of communities, and one was a geographical community, the other was a dispersed community, it's a community based on livelihood, so they were scattered around the city. I struggled they were much better at convincing me about the way they think about the world and approach the world than I ever was about convincing them about. And I think that has sort of, it has shaped my work ever since then, because, and so when I do engage with vulnerable people or marginalized people, the way I engage is more about learning from them as opposed to, involving them, for lack of a better word. So that's one thing. Organizations, elite actors, one thing I've learned is that any kind of engagement requires time. And by time, I mean like 10, 15 years, both in terms of being able to gain trust and access, and also in terms of being able to, if you think that their practices need to be shaped, if like Michelle was saying, that you're critical of what they're doing and you want them to be able to listen to you, at least hear you out, then that takes time. It's not, so the UK higher education sector is now all about impact, and they want measurable impact. So you do a research project, and in 2 years' time, you're supposed to show them how your research has had impact. And my experience, impact takes decades, and sometimes even longer, meaningful impact. Which brings me to the third point, which is sometimes I think that collaboration with communities, especially human communities, is not necessarily the best thing, because you want sometimes to be able to go operate outside of the status quo. And if you're always embedding yourself within the community, then the kinds of knowledges you will kind of co-produce with them will very often remain within the bounds of what is considered acceptable at a particular point in time. So sometimes it is necessary to take a step away and perhaps engage with other communities, or perhaps just sit and think about it over whiskey. So, so there are, so it's a multi-layered, yeah. So I will stop with that.
And Jamie, did you want to speak to the question?
I mean, I'm not sure how much I can add to what's been said. So I think, this isn't, I'll confess, I suppose, that this isn't an area in which I have a huge amount of experience or training, really. So the kind of background of my research is really in political philosophy, where the expectation is that you sit and read other people's arguments and then respond to them and so on. But that being said, right, I have had some limited experiences here, and one good example, I suppose, is a workshop series I did with faith leaders in Pacific Island states facing sea level rise, where there was a kind of mix of academics and practitioners and local faith leaders in the room. And, I think I came into that with ideas about, what the main claims in the literature were and that kind of thing. And it was an excellent opportunity to sit and listen and to hear what people's concerns were firsthand, right? And that's really shaped my work in that strand of my project going forward. So some of the things that people have said about the importance of kind of sitting and listening, I think are something I'd like to take forward a lot more.
Did you want to try to address the question? Yes.
I don't have a lot to add to all the really wonderful things that have been said, other than Jamie had an argument for a pluralist approach, and I think we need a pluralist approach to the way in which we do our work. There are times when community engagement is crucial. The grant I'm on is doing decision support science, and if you do decision support science in a way that simply imposes what scientists think are right for communities, you're probably going to just make a big mess of things, so that it really does take a kind of co-production. But that's really hard because communities are not homogeneous. So you can't just go into community and think you're going to be able to find out, okay, this is what people want to know, because different groups want to know different types of things. But I think that one of the things that is incredibly valuable is also just what Jamie was talking about, what Maria Lugones called world traveling, where we just open ourselves up, we take the time to learn about other types of lifeways. I think you were talking about thinking outside the box at times and not always getting caught in those boxes. So what I would advocate is a pluralist approach to the work that we do. That sometimes I do work that's co-production, and other times I do the sort of just sitting and listening and trying to learn and really hear different ways in which different life ways, and at other times put my philosophical hat on and do conceptual clarification and disruption, which is, part of liberatory thought, is to disrupt normative ways of happening. So one of the things that I think is a shame in education is that we have a tendency within disciplinary training to typically expect the people that we train to learn a way of engaging. And I think what we all need to do is learn multiple ways of engaging, find out where our strengths are, and then be able to interact in different ways depending on what it is that we hope to learn and co-produce.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, this has opened up an invitation for the panelists to speak to each other about any questions or comments that arose as you were hearing each other's talks, and to open up to the audience for any questions that might bridge some of the topics of the panels, which, as it's been a very rich day and change, I will refresh your memory, include indigenous and decolonial approaches to planetary health, pandemics, ecology and well-being, and climate change and planetary health. So, anything that you would like to address to the speakers together, or that the speakers would like to address to each other? As well as, of course, our wonderful keynote. Yes? Oh, the mic is coming to you.
Unfortunately, I missed one panel today, so I'm really sorry, but everything I've attended has been really fascinating. Something that connected them all, and which came up in the most recent conversation and then earlier this morning, was a kind of optimism that I was curious if you could maybe explain or identify and kind of unwork for me. Community building takes years. Maybe we don't have those kinds of, maybe we just don't have that time anymore. And the harm reduction principle from earlier today, maybe that's the only opportunity we have. So it seems like as an outsider, I hear a lot of optimism, and I was curious why. Maybe we're past the point of optimism, and if we are, what does that do for your projects?
Since we're having a sort of conversational event, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Michael Portal. I'm a PhD student here at A&M. I'm studying philosophy and the relationship between ethics and suffering.
Thank you. Do I have the mic? No. Would somebody here like to address the question?
So as a palliative care physician, I want to say thank you for calling me an optimist. I don't often get that. I really appreciate that. And I don't know that it's deserved in this case. I'm not sure that I am a climate change optimist. My hope is to, I think, help people move their sense of a locus of control in something that seems monumentally, impossibly bigger than any of us, inside of us, because that's the only way that change actually happens, is you have to feel like you can participate in it. And so I think that I think we can do something about, and get people engaged to actually change their behavior. It's going to be difficult. There's going to be a lot of people who die as a result of climate change, and it's not going to be their fault. And that is, again, that's my optimistic perspective. So, sorry.
I'm gonna put this young woman on the spot for a minute, because you and I were talking in the break about this, right? We were talking about the way in which optimism can be a kind of trap, a kind of coming in with a diagnostic mindset. And so I'd like to get the perspective here from disability studies, if you wouldn't mind.
My name's Rachel. I'm also a grad student in the philosophy department here. So a little bit earlier, we were discussing how something I've been wondering over the course of the last couple of days, coming from disability studies, is what we might be bringing with us when we're thinking about health, particularly in terms of the work that's done in relation to kind of the curative ideology, the way that health gets framed, and how that's wrapped up with an optimism or a hope in relation to a future ideal state, a past kind of nostalgic state that maybe was and was lost, or maybe never was at all and is just imagined, and then the way that the present gets suspended, kind of abstracted from, and devalued. And so I've wondered to what extent that kind of curative ideology and its temporality might be being brought in at times into approaches like we've seen today, and what it might mean to take some of the insights from disability studies, which challenge that, and begin to think about how to think about disabled kind of presence differently, and what that might mean in this context. I don't necessarily have answers, but that is a little bit of what we were discussing.
So if I could just add. So the reason why I was we were discussing this is you had asked specifically about optimism, which I would actually disaggregate from hope. Because to me, optimism suggests a kind of happy, clappy, everything's going to be all right in the end thing, potentially anyway. And what I like about the notion of the durability of the issues in the current moment, and why I engage with a kind of harm reduction paradigm, is because it does engage with the present, but it doesn't victimize me in the sense that, or other people I work with, in the sense of putting on them, or putting on us each individually, which is part of the problem, putting on us each individually the role of getting rid of structural violence, which is a very demotivating thing, right? So in a way, I have to let go of the certainty of I don't know where the ship is going, because if we're really talking about collaboration and the vulnerability of our interwovenness with one another, if I take the idea that I'm very certain about where I'm going and I'm the only person who can do that thing, I get bound up in a kind of egocentric despair in which I know I can't fix it, but I'm asking myself to fix it. And so I think that what you're asking about is the sustainability of the now time. How do we sustain ourselves emotionally in the now time? And I think that's a fantastic question. And I think the first thing we have to do is not go for the idea that we can't get to utopia, because when humans of the Western kind have thought about utopia and what might be perfect, it's often ended in genocide. So this is like good news, that we don't have to know in our heads exactly where we're going. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Thanks. And I'll just build on that. It's neither optimism nor pessimism, but an embracing of uncertainty, knowing that there aren't guarantees, but nonetheless continuing to work to make a difference, to create paths that are continuously changing. You know, there aren't principles we can follow, and that's very uncomfortable. We are schooled and normed in the West. Humans from the West, is that the way you put it? That sort of mindset, the sensibility we have, is so steeped in the desire for certainty and principles and rules and knowing that we'll make a difference. But I think we can push back against those habituations and continue to work together to envision different ways of being together. not to accept norms that say, here's the way it has to be. Okay, that's a lesson I think we can learn from disability studies, that there are multiple ways of being that, and we need to embrace different possibilities and be able to move flexibly and accept that. I mean, I think you're right. Lots of people are going to die, and we're going to lose a lot of species, and it's not going to be pretty. And I worry about the future for my children, and theirs. But we continue, not with optimism, but with commitment.
So that's unbelievably helpful. All of those answers really, and I want to just clarify, I'm not asking this question because I'm like a nihilist. I don't think it, well, I prefaced by saying I'm not a nihilist because I'm about to be very nihilistic. I also don't think we can predetermine the future, and as soon as we try to play games and do that determination, we end up with genocide. I mean, that's the problem. And Raynor Sherman or Emmanuel Levinas, that's what they call anarchy. I'm on board. I think, unfortunately, we might be a little bit more certain about our climate future than you've let on. It's not that we can be a little bit distressed by it. It's rather that if the scientists are accurate, we're screwed. We've passed that point. So I'm not simply worried about my kids. The catastrophe has already happened. It's already started. And I guess it's not so much that maybe we need to be resolute in the now time and figure out new ways of organizing our lives. It's that we need to just really discard the sense that we can do something. We have to think very differently about what we even want to think we can do, because that optimism will always stand in the way of us having an authentic relationship to what will surely be the end of all of us, right? The end isn't nigh. I'm not back here screaming, the end is nigh, we're done. But there's no possibility for an authentic relationship to our death or planetary death if we really think we can turn the ship around when it's too late.
Yeah, at least the scientists that I work with don't think it's too late. I mean, they don't think that, life will end. They don't even think human life will end. It'll change dramatically, but not end. So it just depends on, what you want to prepare yourself for. So I think that, and I worry about both your caution that we not underestimate the impacts is very important, because otherwise there's a kind of denial that happens. But I think it's equally important that we not overestimate what's going to happen, because what we've seen over and over psychologically is that that just gives people, sort of like, oh, what the hell, live today, tomorrow we die. And it makes it really difficult, it paralyzes people. So this is where I turn to my wonderful friends in psychology who've been doing a lot of work, and you were referring to a lot of it with how we might actually message this and think about ways in different contexts to create possibilities for responding.
I think that is so important, right? Because it then becomes a messaging game. But I guess my concern is that the message might not be true, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe that's what we need to tell people, so they don't despair. But if it isn't actually true, then we should message the truth. I agree with you.
So this discussion is very reminiscent of one that I was a part of, I think in late 2020. It's a book by the sociologist Danielle Sellemeyer from Australia, and it's a non-academic book, but based on her experiences of I don't want to call them wildfires, but the fires of 2019 and 2020. And it's worth reading because her experiences and the discussions we had during the discussion of her book were around precisely this question. And like Daniel was saying, it's really, maybe you didn't include me in the group of optimists, but I'm usually known as Miss Doom and Gloom. And I would agree with you that I don't think the world's, I'm not as convinced about the possibility of multiple pathways into the future. The way I think I would think about it is perhaps along the lines of what Dan might call palliative care, right? So we can do things to make lives in the present that much less intolerable. So not to make them tolerable, but make them that much less intolerable, because it's many lives, human or non-human, are already intolerable. So that's one part of the answer. The other part is that what else do we do, right? What can we do? And which relates to Rosemary's point about, you call it emotional, but I think of it as like, how do I deal with my own discomfort of being a part of this world? Yeah. Right? And that's what motivates pretty much, I think, everything I do. And obviously others might think about it differently, but it's definitely not optimism, or perhaps in my case, not even hope. So, yeah.
Thank you all, really.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so one thing I would say too, and maybe Daniel can speak about this as well, is that when you, I suppose I've done palliative care in the sense that I've accompanied children and adults dying, for maybe a week or two at a time, and what I will say is it's kind of a phenomenal experience. Now, I know that that's not a normative thing to say, but it's like the experience kind of teaches you something. It's kind of emotionally fulfilling. Like, maybe some people see nothing when somebody dies. Well, the first thing I'll tell you is that people aren't alive and then die. That's very unusual, except in an accident or something. When you're looking at illness, people go through huge number of stages, and it's not like when you're with them day and night and you're cleaning for them and caring for them, it's not like they're on a trajectory to death. It's like you never know what's going to happen next. It's very bizarre. I mean, at one level, people who deal in palliative care absolutely know that when this, especially if somebody dies of old age, you know that this is going to shut off, this is going to shut off, and you can almost predict the death. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the interactive experience of sitting with somebody and kind of imagining yourselves with them, not in the sense of I understand what it means to die at all, but in the sense of this is an experience I'm going through with somebody who doesn't just suddenly turn into something when they die, at least not in the way that I've experienced it. And it's actually kind of intriguing. So I'm thinking now about palliative care and harm reduction in relation to this. And I'm not actually, I'm not terrorizing myself with that thought. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to go with it. I'm not going to terrorize myself and say I am responsible for everything that's creating the death of the planet. I'm going to kind of stick with it, if you know what I mean. I don't know if that helps.
Welcome to palliative care, everyone. I'm so thrilled to have you all here with us. This is great.
It's kind of nice because we're normally quite isolated.
It's incredibly very isolating and stigmatized as a field. It's like, oh, palliative care, how do you do that? But yeah, there is something, I would say quite magical in being able to sit with a child or family or anyone as they're approaching the end of life. Not only physiologically, I mean, as Rose said, we can anticipate, things, but there's no such thing as the moment of death outside of, accidents, as the train whistle goes by, of course. Right? Just as birth is a process, death is a process. And if you look at, I think, I forget, someone from the first panel today was talking about how, life and death are all on a spectrum. And if you look in in good, healthy garden soil, all of that is simultaneously happening, simultaneously existing right next to it, right next to each other. So I think that, another sort of aspect of this is we can be doing a lot more to support one another in terms of grief support. There's a lot of things that many people are beginning to have anticipatory grief about things related to climate change, and people are calling it climate anxiety. I would call it anticipatory grief because lifestyles are going to change. a lot of things that we find comfortable right now are going to change. They're not going to be here forever because it's not sustainable. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities to grow for this sort of palliative perspective with regard to climate change.
I thank you all for the responses. I want to welcome back Emily, who has offered to just say a couple of closing remarks for our conference. And thank you all for the conversation, the rich conversation today.
I have to say honestly that I would like the roundtable, in a sense, to serve as the closing remarks, because I've been just so wowed by the papers today, the discussion, our keynote last night that kicked things off and framed things in a way that I think created a really a special way in which we've arrived at a very different place than where we started. So I don't it's almost like this beautiful artwork that I don't want to disturb with any of my own ideas, except to say that I feel like we have arrived somewhere very different. And in listening to the discussions, I have also been really deeply moved. And I think that's because I'm seeing how well people have been discussing from different disciplinary perspectives. And I think for us, organizing the conference, that was something that you always just hope for that. And if it feels as if it's been achieved, you're kind of blown away. So I feel very, that's what it's felt like from my perspective. And I don't think I want to say anything more except that, it's interesting. It will be interesting to see how planetary health develops as this field. It was really interesting to see that Nicole Redvers has been co-authoring on it, and maybe some of you have already reached out and co-authored with planetary health in the titles of your work or talks. But I remember some years ago when I did some work around ecosystem services, which was yet another kind of concept. And as a humanities scholar, I think some of my colleagues in environmental ethics were sort of like, what are you doing with that? So because it's very instrumentalist, a kind of approach. But we felt, I think, the humanists and the social scientists who were involved in that work in two different phases felt that we were making some kind of difference by engaging. So I just hope that this is, the beginning, or one beginning, because I know there are other beginnings out there and other forms of progress with respect to planetary health from people from a range of disciplines to engage with these discussions and to, again, make a difference through our particular kinds of methods and perspectives. So thank you so much, speakers, for all of your hard work.